The Alabama sun bore down mercilessly on the Collins family farm that September afternoon in 1995. Heat waves shimmered above the cotton fields, distorting the horizon into a watery mirage. Grace Collins, 8 years old with auburn braids and a gap-toothed smile, skipped along the dirt path that separated her family's property from the neighboring Bishop farm. Her white sneakers kicked up small clouds of red dust with each step. "Grace, don't go too far," her mother, Jennifer Collins, called from the porch, shielding her eyes against the glare. The screen door banged softly behind her as she stepped out with a basket of laundry. "I won't, Mama," Grace's voice carried back on the breeze, high and carefree. She was heading toward the old oak tree where she'd built a fairy house from twigs and leaves the week before. It stood right at the edge of their property line, near the fence that marked where Collins' land ended and Bishop land began. Jennifer watched her daughter's small figure grow smaller against the vast expanse of farmland. She felt that familiar maternal tug, the one that said her baby was getting too independent, too curious about the world beyond their front yard. But this was Alabama farm country. Children played outside. They explored. It was 1995, and Cullman County still felt like the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, where danger seemed like something that happened in big cities, not here among the cotton and corn. She turned back to her laundry, thinking she'd give Grace 20 minutes before calling her in for sweet tea and cookies. Those 20 minutes stretched into eternity. Larry Bishop stood inside his barn watching through a gap in the weathered boards. The Collins girl came this way often, always alone, always around the same time. He'd noticed her pattern weeks ago. Children were creatures of habit, predictable in their innocence. At 52, Larry had lived on his family's farm his entire life. His parents were long dead, buried in the small cemetery behind the Baptist church in town. He never married, never had much use for social interactions beyond the bare minimum required to sell his modest crops and buy supplies. The townspeople of Cullman knew him as a quiet man, perhaps a bit odd, definitely reclusive. Some remembered incidents from his youth, a fight at the high school that sent another boy to the hospital, allegations of cruelty to animals that were never proven, a restraining order from a woman he'd dated briefly in his 20s. But memories fade in small towns, especially when someone keeps to themselves. Larry Bishop became wallpaper, barely noticed, certainly not feared. He watched Grace examine her fairy house, crouching down to rearrange small stones she'd placed as furniture. The oak tree's shadow stretched long across the ground, reaching toward his property like a dark finger. His property, his land, his opportunity. Larry's weathered hands gripped the barn door. His breathing quickened. He'd prepared for this moment, planned every detail. The sedative was ready, measured precisely. The hidden room beneath his cellar was finished. He'd spent 2 years constructing it in secret, working only at night, telling no one. The entrance was concealed behind a false wall of preserves jars and canned goods, exactly like the old storm shelters common in this part of Alabama. No one would ever suspect. He'd soundproofed the walls with insulation he'd claimed was for renovating his attic. He'd installed ventilation that drew air from underground pipes, invisible from the surface. He'd stocked supplies, canned food, bottled water, blankets, a chemical toilet. Everything a person would need to survive. Everything except freedom. Grace stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. She was about to turn back toward her house when she heard a sound, a kitten's mew, plaintive and desperate. She froze, tilting her head. There it was again, coming from somewhere near the Bishop property. "Kitty?" she called softly, stepping closer to the fence. The sound came again, weaker this time, as if the animal was injured or trapped. Grace knew she wasn't supposed to cross onto Mr. Bishop's land. Her daddy had been clear about that. Larry Bishop ain't right in the head, Robert Collins had told his daughter more than once. "You stay on our side of that fence, you hear me?" But the kitten sounded so sad, so helpless, and it was just a few feet away, right there by that old equipment shed. She could see it, help it, and be back before anyone noticed. It would only take a minute. She climbed through the fence rails, her small body fitting easily through the gap. The red dirt felt the same beneath her feet, even though she was technically trespassing. Everything looked the same endless sky, the same cotton plants rustling in the breeze, the same heat pressing down like a heavy blanket. "Here, Kitty," she whispered, approaching the shed. The sound came from inside, behind a partially open door that swung slightly in the wind. Grace hesitated for just a moment, that childhood instinct for danger prickling at the back of her neck. But the kitten cried again, and her 8-year-old heart couldn't resist. She pulled the door open wider and stepped into the shadowy interior. The temperature dropped immediately, the thick walls blocking the afternoon sun. She could barely see, her eyes struggling to adjust from the bright sunlight to the dim shed interior. "Kitty?" she called again, her voice smaller now, uncertain. That's when she heard it. Not a kitten's cry, but the sound of breathing. Human breathing. Heavy and close. Before Grace could turn, before she could scream, before she could run, Larry Bishop's hand clamped over her mouth. His other arm wrapped around her small body, lifting her off the ground with terrifying ease. She tried to kick, tried to bite, the calloused palm pressed against her face, but he was too strong, too prepared. He'd practiced this moment in his mind 1,000 times. The rag soaked in chloroform came out of his pocket smoothly, replacing his hand over her mouth and nose. Grace's struggles became weaker, her vision tunneling to a pinpoint of light before disappearing entirely into darkness. Larry worked quickly after that. He had maybe 15 minutes before someone came looking. He carried Grace's limp body across his property, not toward the house where someone might see from the road, but toward the old root cellar behind his barn. The door was already open, waiting. He descended the stone steps, Grace's weight barely registering in his strong farmer's arms. The cellar looked ordinary. Shelves of preserves, boxes of old farm equipment, the musty smell of underground storage. But Larry moved to the back wall and pressed a specific stone. The mechanism he'd built activated silently, and a section of the wall swung inward, revealing the hidden room beyond. It was small, maybe 10 feet by 12 feet, with a low ceiling reinforced with steel beams. A cot sat against one wall, a plastic bucket in the corner served as a toilet, and shelves held supplies that could sustain someone for months. A single battery-powered lantern provided the only light. Larry placed Grace on the cot, checking her pulse to ensure she was alive. Satisfied, he turned and left, the false wall swinging shut behind him with a soft click. The locking mechanism engaged automatically. From the inside, there was no way to open it. No handle, no lock to pick, no escape. Grace Collins had vanished from the world. Back at the Collins farm, Jennifer finished hanging her laundry and checked her watch. 25 minutes had passed. She walked to the edge of the porch and called out, "Grace, time to come in, honey." Only the wind answered, carrying the scent of cotton and red dirt across the fields. Jennifer felt the first flutter of concern in her chest. "Grace," she called again, louder this time. Silence. Jennifer Collins stepped off the porch and began walking toward the oak tree, her pace quickening with each unanswered call. When she reached the tree and found only Grace's fairy house empty and abandoned, the flutter in her chest became a cold, gripping terror that would never fully leave her. She ran back to the house, screaming for her husband. Robert Collins dropped the tractor part he was repairing and sprinted from the barn. Within minutes they were searching, calling Grace's name across their property. Within an hour they'd called the sheriff. Within 2 hours, half of Cullman County was combing the fields and woods, their voices echoing across the September afternoon. Grace Collins. Larry Bishop joined the search, of course. He stood with the other neighbors, his face arranged in appropriate concern, volunteering to check his property, his barn, his cellar. Sheriff Tom Hendricks thanked him, never noticing the slight tremor in Larry's hands, or the way he couldn't quite meet anyone's eyes for more than a second. That night, as search parties swept through the darkness with flashlights and the Collins family sat in their living room surrounded by deputies and volunteers, Grace Collins lay unconscious in a hidden room 20 feet underground, her future stolen in the span of 30 seconds. The investigation that would consume Cullman County for months had begun, but it would take 28 years and a routine property sale before anyone would find the answer to what happened to Grace Collins on that September afternoon in 1995. The Cullman County Sheriff's Department had never handled a case like this. Sheriff Tom Hendricks, a 47-year-old veteran of 2 decades in law enforcement, stood in the Collins living room at 3 a.m, his coffee growing cold in his hand as he watched Jennifer Collins sob into her husband's chest. The search had been suspended until dawn, though volunteers still roamed the fields with flashlights, unwilling to give up. "We'll find her, Jennifer," Tom said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. He'd seen the statistics, knew what the first 48 hours meant in a child abduction case. Every hour that passed decreased the likelihood of a positive outcome. "We've got dogs coming in from Birmingham at first light. State police are setting up roadblocks on every highway within 50 miles. Robert Collins looked up, his face haggard and 10 years older than it had been that morning. "You think someone took her? You don't think she just wandered off and got lost?" Tom exchanged a glance with his deputy, Marcus Chen, a young officer who'd transferred from Mobile the previous year. They'd already walked every inch of the Collins property and the surrounding area. Grace's ferry house showed no signs of struggle. Her footprints in the red dirt led toward the fence line between the Collins and Bishop properties, then simply stopped. Not faded or scattered, stopped, as if she'd been lifted off the ground. "We're exploring every possibility," Tom said carefully. "Right now we need to establish a timeline. Jennifer, you said Grace went out around 2:30? Jennifer nodded, wiping her eyes with a tissue that had been shredded into pieces. "Maybe 2:35. I wasn't watching the clock exactly. She was just going to her tree. She goes there all the time, I thought." Her voice broke. "I thought she was safe. You couldn't have known," Tom said gently. "This isn't your fault. Now, did you see anyone else around? Any unfamiliar vehicles on the road? Anything out of the ordinary?" Jennifer shook her head helplessly. Robert spoke up, his voice rough. "Larry Bishop's truck was parked by his barn like always. I saw it when I was working. Nobody else came by our road all afternoon. It's Monday. Folks are working their own farms." Tom made a note. Larry Bishop. The name had come up several times already tonight. His property bordered the Collins farm. His barn sat less than 200 yards from where Grace had last been seen. And there was his history. The violent incidents from his youth that Tom had already pulled from old files. "We searched Mr. Bishop's property," Marcus said quietly. "He gave us full permission, walked us through his house, his barn, his outbuildings. Nothing suspicious. He seemed genuinely concerned." Tom nodded, but something nagged at him. In his 20 years as sheriff, he'd learned to trust his gut. And his gut said there was something off about Larry Bishop. Not just the old incidents. That restraining order from 1982, the assault charge that had been pleaded down to disturbing the peace, but something in his eyes tonight. Too calm, too helpful, like a man playing a part. "I want surveillance on Bishop," Tom said to Marcus as they stepped outside onto the Collins porch. The September night had grown cool, a sharp contrast to the afternoon heat. Somewhere in the darkness, search dogs barked. "Nothing official, nothing he can complain about. But I want to know his movements." Marcus nodded, understanding the delicate balance. They couldn't harass a citizen without evidence, especially in a small county where everyone knew everyone. But they also couldn't ignore a potential suspect just because he'd been cooperative. "You think he's involved?" Marcus asked. "I think we need to be thorough," Tom replied. "Grace's footprints stop at that fence line. Either she climbed through, which her parents say she knows not to do, or someone carried her away. And if someone carried her, they'd need to be close by. They'd need to be watching. They'd need to have a plan." Dawn broke over Cullman County with the kind of pristine beauty that felt obscene under the circumstances. The sky blazed orange and pink, bathing the cotton fields in golden light, as if nothing had changed, as if an 8-year-old girl wasn't missing, possibly hurt, possibly worse. The bloodhounds arrived at 6 a.m., brought by a K-9 unit from Birmingham. Tom watched as the handlers let the dogs smell Grace's pillowcase, her favorite stuffed rabbit, the shirt she'd worn the day before. The dogs immediately picked up her scent, leading the handlers from the Collins porch directly to the oak tree just as expected. Then to the fence line, then through the fence onto Bishop property. Tom's pulse quickened. The dogs were heading straight for Larry Bishop's barn. Larry stood on his porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the procession cross his land. Tom saw no fear in his expression, no nervousness, just that same calm, almost disinterested demeanor, as if having bloodhounds search for a missing child on his property was merely a minor inconvenience. The dogs circled the barn, whining and pawing at the ground, but they didn't alert on anything specific. They moved to the equipment shed, the same shed Tom and Marcus had searched the night before, and showed interest but no definitive indication. One dog led its handler to the old root cellar behind the barn, scratching at the wooden doors that led underground. "Mind if we search your cellar again, Larry?" Tom called out. They'd already been through it once last night, but the dog's interest warranted another look. "Help yourself, Sheriff," Larry replied, his voice flat. "Like I told you, I got nothing to hide. That little girl's disappearance is a tragedy. I hope you find her safe." Tom and Marcus descended into the root cellar, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The space smelled of earth and mildew, exactly as it had the night before. Shelves lined the walls, packed with mason jars of preserves. Tomatoes, peaches, green beans, pickles. Boxes of old tools and farm equipment sat stacked in corners. A few mousetraps, long sprung, gathered dust. Seems like a lot of preserves for a man living alone, Marcus observed, scanning his light across the jars. There must have been hundreds of them. Probably his mother's, Tom said. I remember she was big into canning. Died back in '89, I think. Larry never threw anything away. They searched for another 20 minutes, moving boxes, checking behind shelves, tapping walls for hollow sounds. The dog handler brought one of the bloodhounds down, and the animal sniffed every corner but gave no alerts. Nothing indicated Grace had ever been in this cellar. She's not here, Marcus said finally, frustration evident in his voice. Tom stood in the center of the cellar, slowly turning in a circle, his flashlight beam sweeping across stone walls and wooden shelves. Something felt wrong. He couldn't articulate what, exactly, but 30 years of police work had taught him to pay attention to that feeling. The cellar felt too neat, too organized for a bachelor farmer who lived alone. Those preserve jars were arranged almost perfectly, labels facing outward, dust-free despite the general mustiness of the space. Let's go, he said reluctantly. We're wasting time down here. They emerged into the morning sunlight to find Larry exactly where they'd left him, still standing on his porch with his coffee. He nodded as they approached, his expression neutral. Find anything, Sheriff? No, sir, Tom admitted. But we appreciate your cooperation. If you see or hear anything unusual, you'll let us know? Of course, Larry replied. I hope you find that little girl. Her parents must be beside themselves. As Tom and Marcus walked back toward the Collins property, Tom glanced over his shoulder. Larry Bishop had gone back inside his house, the screen door closing softly behind him. The farm looked peaceful in the morning light, the kind of place where nothing bad could happen. But Tom's gut said otherwise. 20 feet beneath that peaceful farm, behind a false wall in the root cellar that Tom had just searched, Grace Collins lay on a cot in darkness. She'd woken an hour earlier, her head pounding from the chloroform, her throat dry and raw from screaming. The battery-powered lantern provided a dim, yellowish light that made everything look sickly and wrong. She'd screamed until her voice gave out, pounded on the walls until her small fists were bruised, searched every inch of the 10 by 12 space for a way out. There was none. The door, if it could even be called a door, was seamless with the wall. No handle on the inside, no crack to pry open. Grace huddled on the cot now, her arms wrapped around her knees, tears streaming down her face. She could hear muffled sounds from above, footsteps, voices, what might have been dogs barking. She'd screamed again, hoping someone would hear, but the soundproofing absorbed her voice like a sponge absorbing water. She didn't know where she was, didn't know who had taken her, didn't know if she'd ever see her mama and daddy again. The last thing she remembered clearly was hearing a kitten, going into the shed, and then nothing, darkness, and now this nightmare. The lantern flickered slightly, and Grace's heart seized with a new terror. What if the light went out? What if she was left alone in complete darkness? Mama, she whispered, though no one could hear. Daddy, please find me. Above ground, the search continued. Volunteers combed through woods and fields. Police checked abandoned buildings and interviewed neighbors. Local news stations broadcast Grace's photo. Auburn braids, gap-toothed smile, wearing a yellow sundress and white sneakers. Tips poured in, each one investigated and discarded. Days turned into weeks. September became October. The leaves on Grace's oak tree changed color and fell. Halloween came and went, and Jennifer Collins couldn't bear to look at the costume she'd bought for her daughter, a princess outfit that Grace had been so excited about. The FBI got involved, bringing resources and expertise that the small Cullman County Sheriff's Department lacked. They interviewed registered sex offenders within a 100-mile radius. They analyzed phone records, financial transactions, vehicle movements. They brought in psychological profilers who created a hypothetical portrait of Grace's abductor. Likely male, likely someone from the local area, likely someone who had been watching Grace for some time before taking her. The profile fit Larry Bishop perfectly. But fitting a profile wasn't evidence. And despite intense scrutiny, his property searched 3 more times, his movements tracked, his background investigated thoroughly, they found nothing concrete to link him to Grace's disappearance. He's too clean, FBI agent Sarah Mitchell told Tom in November, as the case began to go cold. If Bishop took her, he planned it meticulously. No witnesses, no physical evidence, no mistakes. That level of control suggests this isn't his first time. You think he's done this before? Tom asked, chilled by the implications. Sarah shrugged. Possibly. or he's fantasized about it for so long that when he finally acted, he'd worked out every detail. Either way, without evidence, we can't touch him. By Christmas 1995, the search for Grace Collins had been scaled back to a skeleton crew. The volunteers had returned to their lives. The news cameras had moved on to other stories. Jennifer and Robert Collins sat in their living room on Christmas morning, staring at the presents they'd bought for Grace before she disappeared, unable to return them, unable to accept that she might never open them. "She's still out there," Jennifer said firmly. Her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "I can feel it. She's alive. She's waiting for us to find her." Robert said nothing, just pulled his wife close as she sobbed into his shoulder. He wanted to believe her. God, how he wanted to believe. But as the winter wind howled outside and the empty space where their daughter should be seemed to grow larger with each passing day, hope became harder and harder to hold on to. In January 1996, the Grace Collins case was officially classified as a cold case. The file remained open, but active investigation ceased. Sheriff Tom Hendricks kept a photo of Grace on his desk for the rest of his career, a reminder of the case he couldn't solve, the child he couldn't save, and 20 feet underground in a hidden room that no one knew existed, Grace Collins marked her 4th month in captivity by scratching another line on the wall with a piece of loose stone she'd found. The lines had become her calendar, her way of holding on to time when everything else had been taken from her. She'd learned Larry Bishop's routine by now. He came once a day, always at the same time, bringing food and water, emptying her waste bucket, saying nothing. She'd stopped begging him to let her go, stopped crying in front of him, stopped giving him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. 8 years old, and Grace Collins had already learned that survival meant becoming someone else, someone harder, someone who could endure. She didn't know it yet, but she would have to become that person for 27 more years. The years passed with brutal monotony for Grace Collins. Each day bled into the next in the underground prison that had become her entire world. The 10 by 12 room, once terrifyingly unfamiliar, became as known to her as her own skin. She could navigate it in complete darkness, which she often had to do when Larry forgot to replace the batteries in the lantern, or when he withheld light as punishment for some perceived infraction. By 1998, Grace was 11 years old, though she'd long since stopped celebrating birthdays. Time became measured not in years but in Larry's visits. In the changing of seasons she could only sense through the temperature fluctuations in her prison, in the slow growth of her own body that she tracked by the way her clothes. The same yellow sundress from the day she was taken, now tattered and too small, no longer fit. Larry had brought her new clothes eventually, always purchased from thrift stores in different towns, always in cash, always items that could never be traced. Cheap jeans, plain t-shirts, underwear still in packages. He never spoke during his daily visits beyond terse commands: eat, move back, stand there, move. Grace learned not to ask questions. Questions made him angry, and when Larry got angry, he withheld food or turned off the ventilation system, leaving her gasping in the stale air until he deemed she'd learned her lesson. The psychological warfare was constant and calculated. Larry had figured out early that physical abuse would be counterproductive. He needed her alive and relatively healthy, but mental and emotional torture cost him nothing. He told her repeatedly that her parents had stopped looking for her, that they'd moved away and had new children, that everyone in the world had forgotten Grace Collins ever existed. "You're mine now," he'd say during his visits, standing in the doorway while she pressed herself against the far wall. "Nobody's coming for you. Nobody wants you. This is your life now. The sooner you accept it, the easier it'll be." Grace didn't believe him at first. She held on to memories of her mother's laugh, her father's strong hands lifting her onto the tractor seat, the smell of her grandmother's peach cobbler cooling on the kitchen counter. But memories, she discovered, faded like old photographs left in the sun. By the time she was 13, her mother's face had become blurry in her mind. By 15, she sometimes struggled to remember her father's voice. The only constants were the walls, the darkness, and Larry Bishop's daily visits. Above ground, life in Cullman County continued. Jennifer and Robert Collins aged rapidly, their grief etched into every line on their faces. They never left their farm, convinced that if Grace somehow escaped or was released, she'd come home, and they needed to be there waiting. Jennifer kept Grace's room exactly as it had been the day she disappeared. The bed made, stuffed animals arranged on the shelf, the princess costume still hanging in the closet. "Some people think we're crazy," Jennifer said to a documentary filmmaker in 2005, 10 years after Grace's disappearance. The case had experienced brief renewed interest when a national television show featured it. They think we should move on, accept that she's gone. But I'm her mother. I'd know if she was dead. I'd feel it. And I don't feel it. So I wait. The documentary brought dozens of new tips, none of which led anywhere. Private investigators reviewed the case file and came to the same conclusions the FBI had reached years earlier. Grace had most likely been abducted by someone local, someone who knew the area, someone who'd been watching her. Larry Bishop's name came up again, but he'd been investigated so thoroughly in 1995 that revisiting him seemed pointless. He'd passed multiple polygraph tests. His property had been searched repeatedly. His alibi, that he'd been alone on his farm, as always, couldn't be disproven, but neither could it be confirmed. Sheriff Tom Hendricks retired in 2008. The Grace Collins case still unsolved, still haunting him. His replacement, Sheriff David Morgan, inherited the cold case file, but had little hope of ever solving it. Too much time had passed. Evidence had degraded or been lost. Witnesses' memories had become unreliable. The case was effectively dead, but Grace Collins was very much alive. By 2010, at 23 years old, Grace had spent 15 years in captivity, nearly twice as long as she'd spent in freedom. The girl who'd skipped through cotton fields had become a woman who'd never seen a smartphone, never heard of 9/11 until Larry mentioned it casually during one of his visits, never experienced high school, college, first kisses, driver's licenses, or any of the normal milestones of adolescence and young adulthood. Her world consisted of approximately 120 square feet. She knew every crack in the concrete floor, every water stain on the walls, every irregularity in the ceiling. She'd counted the cinder blocks, 144 of them. She'd memorized the pattern of the ventilation grate, the sound of air moving through the hidden pipes. She could tell what time of day it was by the faint sounds that filtered down from above. Larry's television turning on at 6 p.m., his footsteps overhead as he moved through his evening routine, the cessation of all sound around 11 p.m. when he went to bed. She'd developed coping mechanisms that would have impressed psychologists. She exercised every day, doing push-ups, sit-ups, running in place to keep her body from atrophying. She created elaborate stories in her mind, entire universes populated with characters who became more real to her than her fading memories of actual people. She sang songs she remembered from childhood, her voice the only human sound she heard besides Larry's commands. She held conversations with herself, practicing dialogue, keeping her verbal skills sharp even though she had no one to talk to. Most importantly, she survived. Day after day, year after year, she simply refused to die. It was the only form of rebellion available to her, the only way to resist Larry's complete control. He wanted her broken, dependent, grateful for his mercy. She gave him compliance when necessary, but inside, in the parts of herself he couldn't reach, she remained Grace Collins. She remained herself. Larry Bishop, meanwhile, lived his life above ground with remarkable normalcy. He farmed his land, sold his modest crops, attended the occasional town meeting. He was still the quiet, odd bachelor farmer everyone had known for decades. People who'd suspected him in 1995 had mostly forgotten about it. The intense scrutiny had faded. He was just Larry Bishop again, hardly worth noticing. He'd gotten away with it. Completely and totally gotten away with it. In his mind, Larry had created an elaborate justification for what he'd done. Grace wasn't kidnapped. She was saved. Saved from a world that would have corrupted her, hurt her, destroyed her innocence. He was protecting her, keeping her safe. The fact that this protection involved imprisoning a child underground for decades never registered as contradictory in his warped psychology. He'd constructed a reality where he was the hero of this story, not the monster. He followed the news coverage of Grace's case over the years with detached interest, like someone reading about a fictional character. When the 10th anniversary came and went with renewed media attention, he watched the interviews with Jennifer and Robert Collins without emotion. Their pain was abstract to him, unconnected to his actions. In his mind, they'd been inadequate parents anyway. They'd let their daughter wander unsupervised. They'd failed to protect her. He'd simply stepped in where they'd failed. This delusional framework allowed Larry to sleep soundly every night, to look at himself in the mirror without flinching, to live with what he'd done without apparent guilt or remorse. By 2015, Grace's 20th year in captivity, even her parents' hope had begun to waver. Jennifer was 62 now. Robert 65. They'd developed health problems. Jennifer's heart condition, Robert's arthritis. They knew, though they couldn't say it aloud, that they were running out of time to find their daughter. I used to dream about her every night, Jennifer confessed to their pastor during a counseling session. I'd see her as she was at 8 years old, or I'd imagine her grown up what she might look like. But lately I don't dream about her anymore, and that scares me more than anything. It feels like losing her all over again. The pastor offered prayers and platitudes, but he'd been saying the same things for 20 years. Everyone had. At some point, sympathy becomes exhausted. At some point, even the most dedicated supporters have to move on with their own lives. Grace Collins had become a ghost story in Cullman County. Parents still told their children about her, using her disappearance as a cautionary tale about stranger danger and staying close to home. But to anyone under 25, she was just a name, a tragedy from before they were born, no more real than any other historical event they'd learned about in school. The case file gathered dust in the sheriff's department. The missing person posters had long since faded and been taken down. The reward money, $30,000 raised by the community in those desperate early months, sat untouched in a bank account because there'd never been information worth paying for. Grace Collins had been erased from the world as surely as if she'd never existed. But underground in her prison, Grace marked her 20th year of captivity with a grim determination. She was 28 years old now, though she barely remembered being 8. She'd spent the majority of her life in this room. Her 20s, the decade when most people explored the world, fell in love, started careers, made mistakes, found themselves, had been lived in 120 square feet of concrete and darkness. She'd developed a kind of Stockholm Syndrome relationship with her captor, not out of any affection but out of pure survival instinct. She was polite during his visits. She thanked him for food. She obeyed immediately when he gave commands. She asked no questions, made no demands, showed no resistance. This was what kept her alive. This was the price of survival. But in the privacy of her own mind, she planned. She watched Larry for any sign of weakness, any routine she could exploit, any momentary lapse in his vigilance. She studied the door mechanism every time he opened it, memorizing the sound, trying to understand how it worked. She tested the walls when he wasn't there, looking for any structural weakness, any possible way to break through. She never stopped looking for escape, never stopped hoping, never stopped being Grace Collins even when the rest of the world had forgotten that name. In 2018, Larry Bishop turned 75 years old. He was slowing down, his body betraying him in the way bodies do when age catches up. His knees ached. His hands shook with early Parkinson's. He struggled to maintain his farm, letting fields go fallow, selling off equipment he could no longer operate. The physical demands of farming and of maintaining his secret were becoming too much. He began to think about the future, about what would happen when he died, about the woman in his basement who'd been there for 23 years now, about the secret that would die with him unless he made other arrangements. For the first time since 1995, Larry Bishop began to feel something that might have been fear. Not fear of being caught. He'd long since stopped worrying about that. But fear of mortality. Fear that his carefully constructed world was becoming unsustainable. He looked at Grace during his daily visits with something almost like regret. She was 31 years old now, though he still thought of her as the 8-year-old child he'd taken. Time had done strange things to both of them. "I'm getting old," he said one day, breaking his usual silence. Grace, sitting on her cot, looked up in surprise. He never engaged in actual conversation. "Can't keep up this place like I used to." Grace said nothing, knowing better than to respond unless directly asked a question. But her mind raced. Was he planning to kill her? To release her? To do something different? Thinking about selling, Larry continued almost as if talking to himself. Moving to one of those retirement places in town. Can't manage the farm anymore. Grace's heart began to pound. Selling, which meant people would come to the property, which meant inspections, walkthroughs, potentially renovations, which meant, for the first time in 23 years, the possibility of discovery. She kept her expression neutral, kept her breathing steady, gave no indication that his words had ignited a spark of hope she'd thought had long since died. Larry left without saying anything else, locking the door behind him with the familiar mechanical click. Grace sat in the darkness after he turned off the lantern, her mind whirling. Selling the farm, people coming to the property. It was the first real chance in over 2 decades. For the first time in years, Grace Collins allowed herself to hope. The decision to sell the Bishop farm didn't happen overnight. Larry spent months deliberating, his Parkinson's tremors worsening, his ability to manage the property declining with each passing season. By early 2023, the choice had become less about wanting to sell and more about necessity. At 80 years old, he could barely climb the stairs to his bedroom, let alone maintain a working farm. In March 2023, Larry contacted a real estate agent in Cullman. Susan Reynolds had been selling property in the county for 15 years and had seen her share of neglected farms, but the Bishop place was something else entirely. When she drove up the long dirt driveway for the initial consultation, she found a property frozen in time. The house hadn't been updated since the 1970s. The barn was on the verge of structural collapse, and the fields had gone wild with weeds. "Mr. Bishop, I'll be honest with you," Susan said as they sat in his dusty living room, her notepad balanced on her knee. "The property has good bones. 20 acres, decent location, original farmhouse with character, but we're going to need to do some work before we can list it. Buyers in this market want move-in ready or at least safe enough to renovate." Larry's hand shook as he lifted his coffee cup. "What kind of work?" "Well, that barn for starters. It's a liability. We'll need structural engineers to assess it, possibly demolish it if it's beyond saving. The cellar should be inspected. I noticed the doors when I walked around. A lot of these old root cellars have mold issues or structural problems, and the house needs a deep clean at minimum, probably new paint, definitely new fixtures in the kitchen and bathrooms." Larry's jaw tightened. The cellar. He'd known it would come up eventually, but hearing it stated so matter-of-factly made his chest constrict with anxiety. "The cellar's fine, just storage." "I'm sure it is, but buyers will want documentation. Home inspectors check everything these days. It's liability protection for everyone involved." Susan made a note. "I'll set up appointments with contractors. We'll get estimates and create a timeline. The good news is, once we make these improvements, I think we can list at $350,000, maybe higher depending on what comparable properties are selling for." $350,000. More money than Larry had ever imagined having. Enough to move into a nice assisted living facility, to live comfortably for whatever time he had left. The temptation was overwhelming. But the cellar, always the cellar. That night, Larry descended the stone steps for his daily visit to Grace, his movements slower than they'd been even 6 months ago. The arthritis in his knees made each step painful. He was panting by the time he reached the bottom and pressed the hidden mechanism to open the false wall. Grace stood immediately when he entered, her body language automatically deferring, submissive. She'd become an expert at reading his moods, at making herself small and non-threatening. At 36 years old, after 28 years in captivity, these behaviors were as automatic as breathing. "Things are changing," Larry said abruptly, setting down her meal. Canned soup and crackers, the same thing he'd been bringing for decades. "I'm selling the farm." Grace's heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her face impassive. "Yes, sir. People are going to come look at the property. Inspectors, contractors, real estate people." His roomy eyes fixed on her. "You need to be quiet. Quieter than you've ever been. If anyone hears anything, if anyone finds this room, it'll be bad for both of us. You understand?" "I understand," Grace said softly, though her mind was screaming. People. On the property. Above her head. For the first time in 28 years, other human beings within shouting distance. "I mean it," Larry said, his voice taking on a hard edge. "You make one sound, try anything stupid, and I'll seal this place up permanently. The ventilation shuts off, you suffocate. That's your choice." It wasn't an idle threat. Grace knew the ventilation system could be controlled from outside. She'd lived through his punishments before, knew he had no hesitation about using her need for air as leverage. "I'll be quiet," she promised. "I won't make a sound." Larry studied her for a long moment, trying to assess if she was lying, if she was planning something. But Grace's face showed nothing. She'd learned long ago how to hide every thought, every emotion, every spark of hope or defiance. Finally, he nodded and left, the false wall clicking shut behind him. Grace waited until his footsteps faded completely before she allowed herself to move, to pace the small space, to think. This was it. After 28 years, this was finally an opportunity, but it was also incredibly dangerous. If she miscalculated, if she acted too soon or too obviously, Larry would kill her. She had no doubt about that. He'd kept her alive this long only because he could, because maintaining her imprisonment had been manageable. But if she became a liability, if discovery seemed imminent, he'd eliminate the problem. She needed to be smart, patient, strategic. Over the next few weeks, the property became a hub of activity. Contractors came to assess the barn and deemed it too dangerous to save. It would need to be demolished and rebuilt if the new owners wanted agricultural buildings. Engineers inspected the foundation of the house and found it sound, but recommended updates to the plumbing and electrical systems. A cleaning crew spent 3 days scrubbing years of neglect from the farmhouse interior. And then in late April, a contractor named Miguel Hernandez and his crew arrived to begin renovations on the barn and outbuildings. Miguel, a 42-year-old father of 3, had been doing construction work in Alabama for 20 years. He'd seen plenty of old farms, plenty of decaying structures that needed attention. The Bishop place was typical in most ways. Neglected, but not beyond salvation. The crew started with the barn, carefully demolishing the unsafe structure and clearing the foundation for a new building. As they worked, Miguel noticed the old root cellar behind where the barn had stood. The wooden doors were weathered and warped, covered in decades of grime. "Hey, Mr. Bishop," Miguel called out when Larry emerged from the house, moving slowly with his walker. "You want us to do anything with this old cellar? Doors are pretty rotted. Might want to replace them or at least seal it up if you're not using it." Larry's face paled slightly. "Leave it alone, it's just storage." "Sure thing," Miguel said easily. "But the home inspector's probably going to want to see inside. They check everything. Mold, structural issues, pest infestations. Standard procedure." "I said leave it alone," Larry snapped more forcefully than he'd intended. Then, catching himself, he forced a smile. "Sorry, old man's prerogative to be cranky. But really, there's nothing down there worth looking at. Just my mother's old preserves and some farm equipment. Nobody needs to waste time on it." Miguel nodded, but he made a mental note. In his experience, when property owners got defensive about specific areas, it usually meant there was a problem they didn't want discovered. Water damage, foundation cracks, something that might affect the sale price or require expensive repairs. He mentioned it to Susan Reynolds when she stopped by to check on the renovation progress. "Bishop got weird when I asked about the root cellar," Miguel told her. "Might be nothing, but might be worth having someone check it out before we get to final inspection stage." Susan frowned. "I'll talk to him." "I'll talk. We can't have surprises pop up during the official home inspection. Better to know about problems now and address them." But when Susan approached Larry about the cellar, he was adamant. "I'll handle it myself. Clean it out. Make sure everything's in order. You don't need to worry about it." "Mr. Bishop, I appreciate that, but I said I'll handle it." Larry's voice had that hard edge again, the one that made people uncomfortable. "It's my property until it sells. I'll take care of my own cellar." Susan backed off, not wanting to antagonize a client, but she made a note in her file. If the home inspector flagged the cellar as an issue, she'd have to insist. Below ground, Grace heard all of this. Sound traveled strangely through the hidden room, sometimes crystal clear, sometimes muffled and distorted. She heard footsteps overhead, voices, the sounds of construction. She heard Miguel's question about the cellar and Larry's defensive response. She heard everything and forced herself to remain silent, to wait, to plan. Every fiber of her being screamed to make noise, to pound on the walls, to scream for help. There were people right above her head, people who could save her, people who had no idea she existed. The temptation was almost unbearable, but she knew Larry was listening too, knew he was waiting for her to make a mistake, knew he'd kill her if she forced his hand. So she waited, day after day, listening to the construction continue, listening to the property transform around her, listening to opportunity walk back and forth over her head while she remained silent in her tomb. In early May, the renovations were nearly complete. The new barn structure was framed. The house had been painted inside and out. New fixtures gleamed in the kitchen and bathrooms. The property looked better than it had in decades. Susan scheduled professional photos and began drafting the listing. "We're looking at mid-May for listing," she told Larry during a final walkthrough. "The property shows beautifully now. I really think we'll get multiple offers, possibly above asking price." Larry nodded, his mind elsewhere. Once the property sold, once he moved out, what would happen to Grace? He couldn't take her with him. An assisted living facility wouldn't allow for his storage needs. He couldn't release her. She'd go straight to the police, and even at 80, he'd spend the rest of his life in prison. He couldn't kill her. Despite everything, despite the 28 years of imprisonment, despite the monster he'd become, he still couldn't bring himself to commit outright murder. The problem seemed unsolvable, and yet, he'd committed to selling. The process was too far along to back out now without raising serious questions. As Susan walked through the property with her camera, taking notes for the listing description, she paused at the root cellar. "Mr. Bishop, I really do need to document that we've addressed the cellar. Can we at least take a quick look, just so I can note in the disclosure that it's been inspected?" Larry's hands gripped his walker so tightly his knuckles went white. He opened his mouth to refuse again, but Susan's expression was firm. She'd been patient, but she had professional standards to maintain. The cellar needed to be checked. "Fine," Larry said finally, his voice tight. "Tomorrow. I'll have it cleaned out by tomorrow, and you can come look." That night, Larry sat in his living room, staring at nothing, trying to figure out what to do. He could move Grace temporarily, but where? Any other location would be too risky. He could drug her heavily, ensure she was unconscious during any inspection, but what if she woke up at the wrong moment? What if someone noticed the false wall? What if, after 28 years of perfect concealment, his secret was finally about to be exposed? For the first time since 1995, Larry Bishop felt genuinely afraid. And in her prison below, Grace felt something she hadn't felt in nearly 3 decades. Hope. The endgame had begun. One way or another, her 28-year nightmare was approaching a conclusion. She just had to survive whatever came next. The next morning, Susan Reynolds arrived at the Bishop farm at 10 a.m. as scheduled, accompanied by Miguel Hernandez, who'd volunteered to check for any structural issues in the cellar. They found Larry waiting on his porch, his face drawn and pale, as if he'd aged another 10 years overnight. "You feeling okay, Mr. Bishop?" Susan asked with genuine concern. "You look tired." "Didn't sleep well," Larry admitted. "Old age catching up with me." They walked slowly to the root cellar, Larry's walker leaving tracks in the red Alabama dirt. Miguel opened the weathered doors, and the 3 of them descended the stone steps into the musty darkness. Susan pulled out her phone's flashlight, sweeping it across the space. The cellar looked exactly as it had during all those police searches in 1995. Shelves of preserved jars, boxes of old equipment, the accumulated detritus of decades. Nothing suspicious, nothing unusual. "Seems fine," Miguel said, checking the stone walls for cracks, examining the ceiling beams for rot. "No major structural issues I can see. Needs cleaning, but that's cosmetic." Susan nodded, making notes on her tablet. "I'll note that it's been inspected and found structurally sound. That should satisfy the home inspector." They were turning to leave when Miguel paused, his flashlight beam catching something odd on the back wall. The preserve jars there were arranged too perfectly, their labels all facing precisely outward, without a single speck of dust on them. In a cellar this old, that didn't make sense. "Hey," Miguel said slowly, approaching the back wall. "These jars look like they've been moved recently. See how there's dust everywhere else but not here?" Larry's heart stopped. Susan moved closer, her own light joining Miguel's. They were right. The section of wall with the preserve jars looked different from the rest of the cellar. Cleaner, more organized. Almost as if someone had been accessing this particular area regularly, while the rest of the cellar gathered undisturbed dust. "Probably just where I store the stuff I actually use," Larry said quickly, his voice higher than normal. "The rest is just old junk from my mother." But Miguel was already reaching out, touching the jars, and that's when he felt it. A slight give in the wall behind them. A sense that this wasn't solid stone like the rest of the cellar. His construction experience told him something was wrong here. Something was hidden. "Mr. Bishop," Miguel said carefully, "is there something behind this wall?" And in that moment, Larry Bishop knew it was over. After 28 years of secrets, after 28 years of perfect concealment, his nightmare was about to end. Not with a dramatic police raid or a clever escape, but with a contractor's trained eye noticing a detail that everyone else had missed for nearly 3 decades. Grace in her hidden room heard the conversation through the walls, heard Miguel's question, heard the long, terrible silence that followed, and for the first time in 28 years, she screamed. The scream that tore through the cellar was primal, desperate, the sound of a soul that had been silent for far too long. It echoed off the stone walls, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Susan Reynolds dropped her tablet. Miguel stumbled backward, and Larry Bishop's face drained of all color. "What the hell was that?" Miguel shouted, his heart racing. The sound had been unmistakably human, a woman's voice raw with terror and hope in equal measure. "Help me!" Grace screamed again, pounding on the hidden wall with both fists. "Please, I'm in here, help me!" Susan's hand flew to her mouth. her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. Miguel was already moving, pushing past Larry, pulling preserve jars off the shelves with frantic urgency. Dozens of mason jars crashed to the floor, glass shattering, 20-year-old peaches and tomatoes spilling across the stone. "Oh my God," Susan whispered, pulling out her phone. "Oh my God, there's someone in there." Larry stood frozen, his walker trembling in his shaking hands. He could run, but where would he go? He was 80 years old with Parkinson's disease. He could lie, but the evidence was literally screaming from behind the wall. He could fight, but Miguel was 40 years younger and twice his size. For the first time in 28 years, Larry Bishop was completely powerless. "Please," Grace's voice came again, breaking with emotion. "Please get me out. I've been here so long, please." Miguel found the mechanism, a stone that protruded slightly more than the others, cleverly disguised as a natural irregularity in the wall. He pressed it, and somewhere inside the wall, gears ground into motion. The section of wall swung inward with a mechanical click that had been Grace's soundtrack for 28 years. The smell hit them first. Decades of captivity, unwashed bodies, waste, stale air, desperation. Then the sight, a small room, barely bigger than a prison cell, dimly lit by a battery-powered lantern. And standing in the center, skeletal thin, her hair long and matted, wearing clothes that hung off her wasted frame, was a woman who looked like she'd been buried alive and somehow survived. Grace Collins stood blinking in the flashlight beams, her eyes, unused to bright light, streaming with tears. She raised one trembling hand to shield her face, and that's when Susan saw the lines scratched into the wall behind her. Thousands of them, tens of thousands, 28 years worth of days, marked one by a prisoner who refused to let time become meaningless. "Jesus Christ," Miguel breathed. "Jesus Christ, who are you?" Grace's voice, hoarse from screaming, came out barely above a whisper. "Grace Collins. My name is Grace Collins. I was 8 years old. I was taken in 1995. Susan's legs gave out. She sat down hard on the cellar floor, her phone falling from her nerveless fingers. Grace Collins. The name was legend in Cullman County. The unsolved case. The missing girl. The ghost story parents told their children. And she was alive. Miguel moved first, his construction worker's practical nature overriding his shock. "We need to get you out of here. Can you walk? Are you hurt?" Grace took a tentative step forward, her legs shaky after years of limited movement in a confined space. She'd exercised, yes, but walking more than a few steps at a time was foreign to her. The world seemed to tilt and spin. Miguel caught her as she stumbled, supporting her weight easily. "I've got you," he said gently. "I've got you. You're safe now." Susan had recovered enough to grab her phone and dial 911. "This is Susan Reynolds. I'm at the Bishop Farm on County Road 47. We've found Grace Collins." "Yes, Grace Collins. The girl who disappeared in 1995. She's alive. She's been here the whole time. We need police, we need ambulances, we need everyone. And send someone to arrest Larry Bishop. He's here, he's the one who took her." At the mention of his name, Larry finally moved. He turned toward the cellar stairs, his walker scraping against stone. But Miguel was faster. He settled Grace gently against the wall and moved to block Larry's escape. "You're not going anywhere," Miguel said, his voice hard. "You sit down right there and wait for the police." Larry looked at the younger man, at the blocked exit, at Grace leaning against the wall with tears streaming down her face, at Susan on the phone with 911. He looked at the life he'd lived for 28 years, the secret he'd kept, the power he'd wielded over another human being, and he knew it was finished. He sat down on the cellar floor, his walker clattering beside him, and said nothing. Grace, for her part, couldn't stop crying, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sensory experience of being rescued. There were other people here, real people who weren't Larry, people who knew her name, who were calling for help, who believed her. After 28 years of being told she was forgotten, that no one cared, that no one was looking, here was proof that she'd existed all along, that Grace Collins hadn't been erased from the world. "My parents," she managed to say through her tears. "Are my parents alive? Do they know? Does anyone know I'm here?" Susan moved to her side carefully, as if approaching a wild animal that might bolt. "Your parents are alive, Grace. They never stopped looking for you. They never gave up. They're going to be so happy. They're going to..." Her voice broke. "They've been waiting for you for 28 years. Grace sobbed harder, her body shaking with the force of her emotions. 28 years. She'd been 8 years old. She was 36 now. She'd spent the majority of her life in a room underground. She'd missed her childhood, her adolescence, her 20s, her early 30s. She'd missed everything, but she was alive. Against all odds, after all this time, she was alive. The sound of sirens cut through the morning air within 10 minutes. The Cullman County Sheriff's Department, alerted to the impossible, had responded with every available unit. Sheriff David Morgan arrived first, followed closely by deputy sheriffs, state police, and an ambulance. They descended into the cellar like an invasion force, filling the small space with bodies, lights, and urgent voices. Sheriff Morgan, a weathered man in his 50s who'd inherited the Grace Collins cold case from his predecessor, stood in the entrance to the hidden room and felt his world tilt. He'd read the file dozens of times. He'd known the details by heart, but he'd never expected this. Never imagined that the answer had been here all along, 20 feet underground, hidden behind a false wall that multiple searches had somehow missed. "Grace Collins?" he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Is that really you?" Grace nodded, unable to speak, overwhelmed by the number of people, the noise, the lights, the reality of rescue after so many years of hoping. A paramedic pushed forward, a young woman named Rachel Chen, who immediately began assessing Grace's condition with professional efficiency, tempered by obvious compassion. "Grace, I'm Rachel. I'm a paramedic. I need to check you over, make sure you're okay. Is that all right?" She waited for Grace's nod before continuing. "Can you tell me if you're in pain anywhere? Any injuries I should know about?" Grace shook her head. "Just tired and hungry. Always hungry." Rachel's jaw tightened at the implications but kept her voice gentle. "We're going to get you to a hospital, get you checked out properly, get you fed and hydrated. You're going to be okay. I promise you're going to be okay." As the paramedics prepared to move Grace, Sheriff Morgan turned his attention to Larry Bishop, still sitting on the cellar floor under Miguel's watchful eye. Morgan had to physically restrain himself from violence. This man, this monster, had been interviewed multiple times in 1995. His property had been searched. He'd passed polygraphs. He'd been cleared, and all along, Grace had been here, 20 feet beneath where they'd stood. "Larry Bishop," Morgan said, his voice deadly calm. "You're under arrest for kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and about a dozen other charges I'm going to enjoy adding to that list. You have the right to remain silent." "I know my rights," Larry interrupted, his voice flat. After 28 years of unchallenged control, his power had evaporated in minutes. But he refused to show weakness, refused to apologize, refused to acknowledge the magnitude of what he'd done. "I want a lawyer." "You'll get one," Morgan said coldly. "Right after we process you, photograph every inch of this room and document exactly what you did to that girl. And I want you to know something, Larry. This county has the death penalty, and I'm going to personally make sure the prosecutor pursues it." Two deputies hauled Larry to his feet and cuffed his hands behind his back. As they led him up the cellar stairs into the bright May sunlight, news helicopters were already circling overhead. Someone had heard the police scanner. The media had arrived. Within hours, the entire world would know that Grace Collins had been found alive after 28 years. The paramedics carefully guided Grace up the stairs, Rachel holding one arm, another paramedic named James supporting the other. Grace moved slowly, her eyes squinting against sunlight she hadn't seen in nearly 3 decades. The world above ground seemed impossibly bright, impossibly loud, impossibly big. "It's okay," Rachel murmured. "Take your time. There's no rush. We've got you." When Grace emerged from the cellar into the morning air, she stopped, overwhelmed. The sky was so blue, so vast. She'd forgotten how big the sky was. She'd forgotten the feel of wind on her skin, the smell of fresh air, the warmth of sunlight. She stood there trembling, taking in sensations she'd been denied for 28 years, while paramedics and police officers around her wiped tears from their own eyes. A news helicopter captured the moment. A skeletal woman emerging from underground, flanked by paramedics, her face tilted toward the sun like a flower seeking light. That image would be broadcast around the world within hours, becoming an instant icon of survival and resilience. They loaded Grace into the ambulance, Rachel climbing in beside her. "We're taking you to Cullman Regional Medical Center," Rachel explained. "It's about 20 minutes from here. They have a whole team waiting for you. Doctors, nurses, specialists. Everyone wants to help you." Grace nodded, lying back on the gurney, staring at the ambulance ceiling. A ceiling that wasn't concrete. A space where she could hear traffic sounds and bird songs instead of just her own breathing and Larry's footsteps. Freedom was disorienting in ways she'd never imagined. "My parents," Grace said again. "Someone needs to tell my parents." "Sheriff Morgan is handling that personally," Rachel assured her. "They'll meet you at the hospital." At the Collins farm, 6 miles away, Jennifer and Robert Collins were having breakfast when they heard the sirens. Living in rural Alabama, sirens usually meant a car accident on the highway or a medical emergency. They paid no particular attention until their phone rang. Jennifer answered, expecting a telemarketer or wrong number. Instead, she heard Sheriff Morgan's voice, tight with emotion. "Mrs. Collins, this is Sheriff Morgan. I need you and your husband to sit down." Jennifer's hand flew to her chest, that old fear returning, the fear of bad news, of learning Grace's body had been found, of the nightmare finally ending in the worst possible way. "What is it? What happened?" "We found her," Morgan said simply. "We found Grace. She's alive, Jennifer. Your daughter is alive." The phone fell from Jennifer's hand. She swayed, her vision darkening at the edges. Robert was there immediately, catching her, asking what was wrong, what had happened. Jennifer couldn't speak, could only point at the phone where Morgan's voice was still calling her name. Robert picked it up. "This is Robert Collins. What's going on?" "Mr. Collins, we found your daughter. Grace is alive. We're transporting her to Cullman Regional right now. You need to get there as soon as possible." Robert felt his knees buckle. Alive. After 28 years. Grace was alive. The daughter they'd mourned. The child they'd never stopped looking for. The ghost that had haunted every moment of their lives for nearly 3 decades. She was alive. Where? Robert managed to croak. Where was she? "The Bishop farm," Morgan said grimly. "Larry Bishop kept her in a hidden room in his cellar. All this time she was there. All this time." Robert made a sound that was half sob, half roar of rage. Larry Bishop, the man they'd suspected, the man who'd been cleared, the man who'd lived 6 miles away for 28 years while their daughter suffered underground. "We're coming," Robert said. "Tell her we're coming. Tell her we never stopped looking. Tell her we love her." "I will," Morgan promised. "Drive safely. She's waited 28 years. She can wait 20 more minutes." Robert hung up and turned to his wife, who was sobbing on the kitchen floor. Jennifer, look at me. Grace is alive. Our baby is alive. We need to go to the hospital. We need to go now." They made the drive to Cullman Regional in 15 minutes, Robert pushing his old truck to speeds it hadn't reached in years. They arrived to find the hospital surrounded by news vans, reporters, police vehicles. The story had exploded across every news outlet in the country. Grace Collins, alive after 28 years. Hospital security had been prepared for the media circus and escorted Jennifer and Robert through a side entrance, away from the cameras. They were taken to a private waiting room where doctors briefed them on Grace's condition. She's malnourished, dehydrated, and suffering from severe vitamin D deficiency, Dr. Sarah Martinez explained gently. She has muscle atrophy from years of limited movement, and we're running tests to check for any other health issues. Psychologically, the doctor paused. 28 years of captivity will have profound effects. She'll need extensive therapy, support, time to adjust. But physically, miraculously, she's stable. She's alive. And she's asking for you. Jennifer sobbed openly now, Robert's arm around her shoulders. "Can we see her? Please. Can we see our daughter?" "Of course," Dr. Martinez said. "But I need to prepare you. She's not the 8-year-old you remember. She's a 36-year-old woman. She's been through trauma we can barely comprehend. She may not look like you remember. She may not act like you remember. Give her time. Give her patience. Give her love." They nodded, unable to speak, and followed Dr. Martinez down a hallway to a private room. The door was closed, guarded by a police officer who stepped aside when he saw them. Dr. Martinez knocked softly, then opened the door. Grace sat in the hospital bed, IV lines in her arms, wearing a hospital gown, her long matted hair pulled back from her face. She looked up when the door opened, and her eyes, her father's eyes, still the same blue they'd always been, met theirs. For a long moment, nobody moved, nobody breathed. 3 people separated by 28 years of grief and trauma and impossible distance, now suddenly in the same room, the same space, the same reality. Then Jennifer moved, crossing the room in 3 steps, pulling her daughter, her baby, her Grace, into her arms. Robert was right behind her, wrapping his arms around both of them, and all 3 Collins family members sobbed together, holding each other. 28 years of separation, collapsing into this single moment of reunion. "Mama," Grace whispered into her mother's shoulder. "Daddy, you're really here. You're real. We're real," Jennifer sobbed. "We're here. We never stopped looking. We never gave up. We knew you were out there. We knew." They held each other while nurses and doctors quietly left the room, giving the family privacy. They held each other while outside. The media frenzy grew and Larry Bishop was processed into the county jail. They held each other while the FBI opened an investigation into how such a massive failure had occurred, how a child had been hidden in plain sight for 28 years. They held each other, and for the first time since September 1995, the Collins family was complete. 3 months after her rescue, Grace Collins sat in a therapist's office in Birmingham, trying to describe what freedom felt like to someone who'd never lost it. Dr. Patricia Williams, a specialist in trauma recovery, listened with patient understanding as Grace struggled to articulate the overwhelming strangeness of her new life. "Everything is too much," Grace said quietly. "Too many sounds, too many people, too many choices. Yesterday, my mom asked what I wanted for dinner, and I had a panic attack because I couldn't decide. For 28 years, someone else decided everything. And now you have to learn how to be autonomous," Dr. Williams finished gently. "Grace, what you're experiencing is completely normal given what you've survived. Recovery isn't linear. Some days will be better than others." Grace nodded, pulling her cardigan tighter around her thin frame. She'd gained 15 pounds since her rescue but still looked fragile, haunted. The physical recovery was progressing well. Her vitamin levels were normalizing, her muscles growing stronger with physical therapy. But the psychological wounds ran deeper than any medical scan could reveal. Outside the therapy office, the world continued its fascination with her story. The trial of Larry Bishop was scheduled for January 2024, and media coverage was relentless. Grace had given one carefully controlled interview to a national news program, hoping it would satisfy public curiosity and allow her some privacy. Instead, it had intensified interest. People wanted to know everything: how she'd survived, what she'd endured, how she'd maintained her sanity. What they couldn't understand was that she hadn't maintained it. Not really. Grace Collins at 36 was fundamentally different from who she might have been. 28 years in captivity had reshaped her personality, her worldview, her very sense of self in ways that could never be undone. But she was learning to live with it, learning to navigate a world that had changed beyond recognition during her imprisonment. Smartphones, social media, streaming services, electric cars, everything was alien and overwhelming. Her parents had bought her a phone, but she rarely used it. The idea of being constantly reachable, constantly connected, terrified her after so many years of complete isolation. Jennifer and Robert had been extraordinary. They'd sold their farm, too many painful memories, and bought a small house in a Birmingham suburb where Grace could access better medical care and therapy. They walked beside their daughter through every difficult moment, never pushing, always patient, grateful beyond words to have her back regardless of how changed she was. "My mom keeps apologizing," Grace told Dr. Williams, "for letting me play outside that day, for not watching me closer, for not finding me sooner. I tell her it wasn't her fault, but she doesn't believe me." "Survivor's guilt affects families too," Dr. Williams said. "Your parents lived 28 years blaming themselves. That kind of guilt doesn't disappear overnight just because you've been found." Grace understood guilt. She carried plenty of her own. Survivor's guilt for being alive when statistically she should have died. Guilt for the years her parents spent suffering. Even a twisted guilt instilled by Larry that she was somehow complicit in her own captivity. Unpacking all of it would take years. The trial in January was brutal but cathartic. Larry Bishop pleaded not guilty, his defense attorney arguing diminished capacity due to mental illness. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: the hidden room, Grace's testimony, forensic evidence of 28 years of imprisonment. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Grace attended the sentencing hearing, sitting between her parents as the judge addressed Larry Bishop. "You stole 28 years from Grace Collins," Judge Thompson said, his voice hard. "You stole her childhood, her adolescence, her young adulthood. You robbed her of experiences, relationships, opportunities that can never be recovered. The law allows me to impose a life sentence without possibility of parole, and that is exactly what I'm doing." Larry showed no emotion as he was led away in chains. Grace felt nothing watching him go. No satisfaction, no anger, no closure. He'd been the center of her universe for 28 years, the source of all power and control. Now he was just an old man being taken to prison, where he'd die. The asymmetry was stark. 6 months after her rescue, Grace took her first steps toward building an independent life. She enrolled in online high school completion courses, determined to earn her diploma despite being 18 years behind her peers. She volunteered at a local animal shelter, finding comfort in caring for creatures who, like her, had been abandoned and mistreated. She began writing, not about her captivity, not yet, but fiction, poetry, anything that let her explore emotions too complex for therapy sessions. "I'll never get those years back," Grace told a journalist during a follow-up interview 1 year after her rescue. "I'll never know who I might have been if Larry hadn't taken me. But I'm learning who I am now, and that's enough." The Collins family slowly rebuilt their lives around their expanded reality. Grace would never be normal by conventional standards. She still struggled with crowds, loud noises, and enclosed spaces. She had nightmares that left her screaming. She sometimes retreated into herself for days, unable to engage with the world. But she also laughed. She smiled. She discovered she loved thunderstorms and hated country music. She learned to drive at 37, cried tears of joy at her first sunset at the beach, and decided that chocolate ice cream was the greatest invention humanity had ever produced. 3 years after her rescue, Grace Collins stood at a podium addressing a conference on child safety and missing persons cases. Her auburn hair, now cut short and professionally styled, gleamed under the lights. She'd gained weight, filled out, looked healthier than anyone had seen her since 1995. "My case highlighted massive failures in investigation procedures," Grace said, her voice steady. "Hidden rooms should have been detected. Property searches should have been more thorough. But what's done is done. What matters now is ensuring no other child suffers what I suffered. That's why I'm establishing the Grace Collins Foundation, dedicated to improving missing person investigations and supporting families of the missing." The audience gave her a standing ovation. Jennifer and Robert, sitting in the front row, cried openly. Their daughter, their miracle, had not just survived. She was thriving. That night, back in her small apartment overlooking Birmingham, Grace sat on her balcony watching the city lights. 39 years old now. She'd spent 28 years buried alive and 3 years learning to live again. The math still seemed impossible, but she was here. She was free, and every day she chose to keep going. Grace Collins had been found, but more importantly, Grace Collins had found herself.